Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Our objective is to have one-on-one conversations with in-depth thought leaders on the issues that are shaping the future of British Columbia. And each week before we get started, I'd like to invite our correspondent Mike Manier to give us a little bit of history and background on the issue from the perspective of the guest that we're having today. Today, that's Tom Syer from the Business Council of British Columbia. What do we know about Tom?
Stu, Tom is someone that has a lot of experience both on the for-profit side of the table as well as on the government side of the table working with First Nations. He was Deputy Chief of Staff under Gordon Campbell and then spent several years recently working in the renewable energy sector, working specifically on Aboriginal relations. And he's now with the BC Business Council where he is looking after communications development and also working on the Aboriginal response to this Williams case, which of course the Supreme Court of Canada came down with in June, which provides this very new context for looking at Aboriginal land claims, going from what was originally a postage stamp approach to basically looking at First Nations and where are you now and what are you doing in the current context. Now moving to this much more expansive definition of land and title that looks at the history of fishing and hunting and the nomadic movements of First Nations people, potentially giving First Nation bands a much larger swath of British Columbia that they will be running.
A lot of people went yikes when they heard that, not to be trite about it, but the Business Council said, whoa, let's just cool our heads, let's get off the front page and take a look at this and say, no, it's really business as usual. Are they correct in that?
Well, I think you're right, Stu. There's no doubt that the business community is trying to put its best foot forward on this. There's a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak, with resource projects in British Columbia. We know the Prosperity mine, the Tsilhqot'in mine that was smack dab in the middle of the Tsilhqot'in lands that were at the core of this decision. That huge mine project is very much on hold as a result of First Nations claims. But the Business Council and Tom Syer in particular have said, look, yes, there are concerns that this could freeze economic opportunities, mind you, at a time where we're still very much in an uncertain economic world. But he's also done some wonderful blog posts on the BC Business Council website, noted that there are lots of opportunities within this court ruling, that if you look at business from a cooperative approach, if you seek to engage First Nations first before you even start your planning process for a project, that there are lots of economic opportunities. He points to data that shows that successful data where First Nations have worked with companies where they were engaged early on and where First Nations, if they can see the economic opportunity and if there's a meaningful partnership developed, that they will come on board and be a contributor to the development.
Well, on that note, let's go to that conversation that I recorded with him on August the 11th right here at La Cigale. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a very important topic, land claims in British Columbia. From your perspective, where are we at right at the moment, especially in light of the Tsilhqot'in decision that's just come down from the Supreme Court?
Well, I think we're on a path to reconciliation, and there's a lot of question about how far down the road are we to reconciliation in this province. And I would argue that we're actually a lot further down the road than some people might think in light of what we sometimes see in the front page of the papers. I think we're actually a long way down the path to reconciliation, and there's lots of interesting things happening on the land base, some good and some challenging from a Business Council perspective.
It's interesting that you say that because there are some people who will go, well, no, the elbows have just come up and we're actually nudging ourselves a little bit further apart. Are we not almost setting ourselves up for some sort of confrontation because we've got a group that for the last 150 years basically has been saying, hang on a second, you took our land, and now they're going, okay, now the courts recognize that it's ours. How does that bring us closer together?
Yeah, well, I think if we get off the front pages for a minute and look at the relationships, which are the foundation of reconciliation, and actually what's happening economically in this province, we've got hundreds of agreements now between businesses and First Nations to enable and share prosperity in this province in a mutually beneficial way. The provincial government has got literally dozens of instruments that they use to promote economic reconciliation, ensure that we can get things done on the land base. And I actually think that's the storyline that's missing from the headlines. There certainly are some challenges, and we do see them in the front pages, but we also see a whole variety of areas where success is happening, success that's leading to prosperity for all communities in this province.
Business leaders, the people who have the resources, financial resources, to be able to invest in big projects in British Columbia, though, they read the newspaper. They tap into the zeitgeist that is here and say, maybe I'll wait. And is that not really the biggest challenge? Maybe we are moving closer together over here, but we have decision makers who may go, I'm uncertain.
One of the privileges and benefits of working with the Business Council, I run our Aboriginal Affairs Committee, so we've got about 40 of the kind of leaders in the business community doing agreements, economic development with First Nations across the province. And I think the storyline that they would tell you is that, yeah, you know, some of it's tough work, but a lot of it is moving along very well, in fact. And we are getting agreements, we're getting projects developed, we're sharing the benefits. You know, I think some of the legal framework that has led to the whole notion of both rights and title, the duty consult and accommodate, all of those legal framework that's been in place for quite some time now, we are executing well on the ground on it. And you know, I think when you talk to our group, and we're 250 of the larger corporations in the province, you can get things done. Yeah, are there investment challenges? No question. But are we at gridlock? Are we at problems everywhere in the province? The answer is absolutely not. We're moving forward.
Okay, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is a mining executive or a forestry company executive, and they're saying, okay, I want to make a substantial investment into this part of the province. But there is a claim, not even title granted, there's a claim here, and there's an overlapping claim. Who do I deal with?
Well, we have a very robust process of having the province. For those companies who maybe are new to the province and don't understand how to do these things, the consultation protocols are now fairly well established. The province does help companies find out who they should go talk to, help understand the process of coming to agreements. And then the province themselves has a whole set of tools that go help enable the development, whether that's revenue sharing from the mineral tax revenues that the Crown receives. All of these things are now in place to help deal with the exact issues you said. What should I go do when I've got these various challenges? And there are challenges. I'm not trying to diminish that, but what I'm saying is we do have a very robust set of tools now to go deal with that and deal with it in a way that's been quite successful.
I have to tell you, I was with a business leader on the day that the decision came down, and there was almost panic that I could sense in their initial response, because they're going, uh-oh, what does this mean? We've gone from postage stamp to mountaintop, and not just the duty to consult, but the need to obtain consent. And there was actual fear. And I know that you're saying, well, let's not panic.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just me. A lot of the First Nations leaders we deal with are saying the same thing. You know, when they say, what's changed? Well, not a lot's changed in terms of the process of coming to economic reconciliation. A lot of those process issues haven't changed. Certainly the definition and finding of title has changed. You know, the Supreme Court of Canada has made that very clear. But one thing I think we need to understand is the test of proving title is a very onerous one for First Nations. If you read the judgment from Justice McLaughlin and a unanimous decision at that. It is a very robust test. In the Tsilhqot'in case, it took them over 2 decades to get to that point of actually finding title. I think what we're hopeful for, that it was never a question of, you know, is there no title in the province? We've always known that there's rights and title as part of the Constitution, as part of the framework, as part of the 200 plus First Nations in this province. But I think what we need to continue to work on is understanding that title certainly is going to be present on the land base, but it certainly isn't going to be 110% of the province, as some people have claimed. The Tsilhqot'in decision of itself, the actual finding of title was for a fairly small portion of their overall territory in finding. So I think there's a little bit of caution that needs to come into play when we think about a new notion of title and what it actually means on the land base. And I think what we're hopefully going to be finding, and certainly some of our dealings with First Nations leaders, we found this, there isn't a real strong desire to go out there and spend another 2 decades in course to prove title. What there is an interest in doing is getting back around the table to negotiate good agreements for both parties, and based on respect, recognition, and reconciliation. So all those kind of processes and steps that we've had in place for the past little while, they're going to continue on. But I think it is important to acknowledge that the finding a title is significant, and you can't say that it wasn't significant.
You say come back to the table, but if we take a look at the Treaty Commission, it's been stalled for quite some time. And there's a number of bands that have just opted out. They've said, I'd rather go to the court.
Yeah. A lot of interior First Nations food.
How do we move beyond that? Or does it matter when we look in light of Delgamuukw that everybody is saying we have to consult anyway?
Yeah. And I think it's definitely the latter. Our definition of table is not so much a treaty table anymore. It's whether you want to call it a reconciliation table under the new relationship, or an economic reconciliation, or just frankly good business practice in this province. That's the table that our business leaders are convening with First Nations across the province on a range of projects. Whether it's a new resort or a new mine or a hydro project or a wind farm. All of these things are now being discussed, conversed around a table, and from our perspective, the challenges that are out there are real, but the benefits are also real, and they're being realized.
So as a business leader, how do I move forward now? Do I have to have 3 streams of engagement? Before there was me, there was the government, and now there has to be a third stream of engagement. How do we make that work?
Yeah, I think we would probably argue that the engagement size hasn't fundamentally changed. Over the past 10 years, we've seen this progressive shift towards sitting around and working out economic, environmental, social issues with respect to project development in this province. Yes, there's an economic component to it. Yes, there's an environmental component to it. Yes, there's a social component to it. And what we have seen is this buildup over time of literally hundreds of agreements now in the province being implemented, being operationalized, that allow projects to move forward in a way that's beneficial for everybody. So when you say, well, what's fundamentally changed? I think our belief is that we've got a pretty robust system in place already, that a lot of the fundamentals aren't going to change and don't need to change, really.
What happens, though, if the province comes along and says, okay, we're in agreement, we're working together on this. We as a province need to derive this amount of revenue for us to be able to handle all the work that we have to do as the government of the province of British Columbia. The First Nation says, well, we need to derive this amount of revenue to meet even the test from Justice McLaughlin that says that the current and future generations can benefit from the land. And then industry says, but there's not enough for us to justify this.
How you divvy up the pie, the resource rent, as the economists like to describe it as. I think you've actually touched upon one of the bigger challenges, maybe the biggest challenge coming out of this decision, is there are potentially going to be some implications for government and how they looked at revenue sharing. They looked at revenue sharing on a certain basis, a certain understanding of title, and that's changed. How much will government have to change to meet what is probably a new test around that right now? I think we would argue probably not as much as people think. Currently, for example, in the mining sector, 37.5% of all the mineral tax that the provincial crown comes in can go out to First Nations. Will that need to move up in areas where there's strong, strength of claim or a title? Possibly. But I think we need to go eyes wide open about that and understand that that is going to be a part of the process. I do think part of the issue for industry in their engagement with First Nations is to not, to a certain extent, get dragged into those government-to-government conversations around that. There are business relationships that come with First Nations in industry, and then there are government-to-government relationships that's come with certain aspects of the royalty regime. Industry needs a return to make a project happen, and I think there's a willingness to converse about what that is and who's going to get what. But at some point in time, though, there must be a return, otherwise there's no development.
How incumbent is it upon industry to go to those First Nations that they plan on investing in their territory and say, we're here to work with you, but more importantly, we're here to train your people, like so that they come up to the standards that are required? And how big of a task is it to do that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest areas and frankly most promising areas for constructing a relationship that really delivers benefits to all parties. You know, when we think about project development in remote areas, it's sometimes hard to find workforce areas. You know, my personal background in doing hydro projects and wind farms, you can actually get a significant benefit from working with the local First Nations because you don't have to fly them in from somewhere else. They're local, they might understand the terrain and better than the companies that you're working with that are actually constructing projects. So there's the potential for those benefits. I think what we're finding is exactly the point I think you're trying to make, which is, okay, how do we bring that capacity to where it needs to be so you can maximize the benefits for the First Nations and for your company as you do development? And that's a frontier that I think we're seeing great improvements on. Lots of work left to do on that front as well.
Lots of work, and you could lay the, I have to say this, the blame right at our own footsteps, because we left a whole group of our population ill-prepared to take on a challenge of this nature, or of this scope.
Sure, and I think when you look back at things like the Kelowna Accord and attempts we've tried to do to address what really was a systemic challenge, you know, one of the most negative legacies of the colonial era around that entire issue. But this is, I think we should view it as an opportunity though. And BC does have some unique advantages. Across the country, we've got the highest high school completion rates of any First Nations groups in Canada. We do see some really interesting opportunities there to really look at BC in a positive light, accelerate some of the stuff that's happening on the capacity development side. You know, we've got the new Relationship Trust Fund that was established to help with exactly that issue. You know, I think this is one area where there's lots of, you know, roll up your sleeves and get it done work that needs to happen and is happening, but it definitely still remains a big challenge.
So we look at this as being a provincial issue in many ways, but it's also a federal issue. Where do the feds come in on this?
Yeah, well, we're at the Business Council, we're big fans of Doug Eiford's report, the recent report commissioned by the Prime Minister to come and take a look at what's happening on the West Coast, you know, broadly speaking around market access issues for our energy products. And, you know, I think he produced a really interesting report that sent, you know, in a very positive light in our mind, a direction to Ottawa. You need to be more engaged here on the ground with actually what is happening economically, to work much more collaboratively with First Nations and the province to deliver new programs. Think a little bit differently about how your role and your responsibility as the Crown to helping First Nations both realize the benefit and also meet your agenda. You know, the federal government's got a big agenda for energy and other development, the gateway to the Pacific that you know, we're certainly big fans of, and that there should be a benefit set that's derived by First Nations from that initiative. And I think Doug's report and some of the recent announcements that we've just seen from the federal government on trying to implement and bring new tools to the table, incremental treaty making opportunities that the federal government perhaps hasn't had in the past. We think this is the direction that should be happening. We'd like to see the federal government be doing a lot more on the ground.
So, in light of the decision, if we take a look at the history leading up to it, especially Delgamuukw, which started to move us down the track of consultation, not necessarily to get consent, but just shy of that. So we're already moving in that direction. There was a little bit of a, what does this mean? It sounds to me from our conversation that you believe that business has very quickly come to an understanding of what this means and gone, okay, it's still all systems go.
Yeah, and I think the market response, if you want to call it that, over the last 15 years is based on the opportunity that is here. Is that I think what one would hope and expect from the business community, which is to understand the issue, engage, and try and move forward in a way that allows projects to happen. And we've seen success in this area. There's no question in my mind we've seen success in that area. And industry's gone a long ways down that road over the last number of years, in our opinion.
Will industry be in a position where they're going to have to say, well, here's the provincial legislation, but here's the First Nations restrictions around the way that we operate, which may be slightly at odds with the provincial government? Are they going to have to work with these two streams of governance in a particular area to figure out what's going to work for that project?
Yeah, and I think this is where we get into some of the heavy lifting that our expectation government would be on this relatively quickly coming out of the Tsilhqot'in decision. You know, we saw a few weeks back now that the Tsilhqot'in put out their kind of mining protocol, how they expect mining to happen in these specific areas. And now I think what business needs is they need certainty, and certainty from a regulatory framework means understanding exactly what the rules are. So this is the type of work that I think we'd expect the province to be engaging with First Nations on, and doing that work very, very quickly.
So when you look to the future, when it comes to the land claims issue, what does British Columbia look like 25, 30 years out from now?
I think on the land claims issue, I think we are going to see some more treaties. I don't think we're going to see a lot, but I think our hope is 20 years out, we're going to see one of the most robust expansions of businesses in First Nations communities in a very surprising way. We already see it to a certain extent right now, but I think we're going to see a real proliferation of First Nations businesses going forward. Some of which, yes, will be based on how they operationalize and understand title and high strength of claims areas. I think that's some of the First Nations will do an effective job at learning to leverage that in a more significant way than they have to date. But I think it's already the stuff that's already happening on the land base. 20, 25 years from now, I think we're going to be talking about successful global partnerships, and hopefully BC as a bit of a case study on how you can move forward, solve some of the social problems. Again, back to some of the conversation we started off with, that we do see as a country. It's not acceptable that we don't have the same health outcomes, the same educational outcomes in First Nations communities in a country as wealthy as Canada. And I think if we do this right, economic reconciliation must be the core component of advancing that.
Yeah, it will be the core of it. It's I guess the hub that all others are attached to.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks
Thank
for joining
you.
us.
My pleasure.
Yeah.